the true story of an abandoned hospital that still haunts. They say no one leaves St. Mary's Asylum alone at night, not even the shadows. The last recorded visitor, a thrill-seeking journalist, was found days later in a fetal position, her fingernails torn to the bone. Her camera, still recording. The footage revealed only one thing: endless screaming in an empty hallway. The legend of St. Mary's Asylum isn't just a tale told to scare children or keep teenagers from sneaking out at night. It's a stain, a wound in the collective memory of the nearby townsfolk that refuses to heal. Perched at the edge of a dense, suffocating forest in rural Massachusetts, the asylum was constructed in the late 1800s. A towering Gothic monstrosity of blackened stone and iron gates. Its purpose was clear from the beginning, not to help its patients, but to hide them. The mentally ill, the undesirables, the forgotten souls deemed too broken or inconvenient for society, they were all sent to St. Mary's, never to return. But what makes St. Mary's infamous isn't just the cruelty or neglect that happened within its walls. It's the whispers, the inexplicable and chilling phenomena that started almost immediately after the asylum opened. Caretakers would swear they heard voices echoing down the empty corridors late at night. Soft, pleading whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "Help me," they'd hear. Or "Please, I can't see." At first, they dismissed it as the wind passing through the poorly insulated halls or the desperate cries of patients locked in isolation cells. But the voices didn't stop when the patients were silent. In fact, they only grew louder during the quietest hours of the night, as if the building itself was crying out for release. By the 1930s, St. Mary's reputation had darkened even further. Nurses began refusing to work the night shifts, claiming they felt watched as they walked the dimly lit hallways, the old gas lamps casting flickering shadows that didn't always align with their movements. One nurse, a young woman named Margaret, was said to have quit after a single shift. She arrived at the front gates pale and shaking, her hands gripping her rosary so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She refused to speak about what she had seen, but her replacement found her uniform neatly folded on the floor of the isolation wing's locked ward, though Margaret had sworn she'd never stepped foot in there. The isolation wing was the heart of St. Mary's horrors. Reserved for the untreatables, this section of the asylum was buried deep within its labyrinthine structure, far from the main entrance and down a long, narrow corridor that seemed to grow colder with every step. Patients sent to the isolation wing were rarely seen again. The staff would whisper about the screams, blood-curdling, unending cries that could make even the most hardened orderly break into a cold sweat. They claimed the walls of the wing were scratched and gouged as if by claws, though no patient was ever given anything sharp enough to cause such damage. One particular room, known only as Room 19, became the stuff of nightmares. Legend has it that the patient who stayed there, a woman named Eleanor, who had been committed after drowning her infant son, began speaking in a language no one could understand. Her voice, deep and guttural, was said to echo even after the room was empty. When Eleanor was found dead in her bed one morning, her face frozen in an expression of absolute terror, the staff sealed off the room with wooden boards. Yet the faint sound of a baby crying was often reported by anyone who walked past the door. The whispers weren't just confined to the isolation wing. Over the years, the entire asylum seemed to take on a life of its own. Visitors described an overwhelming sense of unease upon entering, as if the building itself resented their presence. Doors would swing open on their own, revealing empty rooms that smelled of decay and mildew. Light bulbs would flicker and burst, plunging rooms into sudden darkness. And the whispers, always the whispers, would grow louder the longer someone stayed. In 1971, the asylum was finally shut down after a mysterious fire consumed the East Wing, killing 6 patients and 2 staff members. The official report claimed it was caused by faulty wiring, but the firefighters who entered the building told a different story. They described hearing screams, agonized, inhuman wails that seemed to come from every direction. One firefighter swore he saw a figure standing at a window on the 3rd floor. its silhouette illuminated by the flames, though that section of the building was supposed to be empty. Despite the fire, much of the asylum remained intact. The town petitioned to have it torn down, but every attempt to do so was met with strange accidents and sudden, inexplicable illnesses among the workers. Eventually, the project was abandoned, and St. Mary's was left to rot. But the whispers didn't stop. Hikers passing through the nearby woods reported hearing faint voices calling out to them, begging for help. Some even claimed they saw figures moving in the broken windows at night, their outlines barely visible against the darkened sky. To this day, the townspeople refuse to go near St. Mary's. It's said that the building holds on to the souls of those who died within its walls, trapping them in an endless cycle of torment. The asylum's nickname, the House of Eternal Whispers, is more than just a title. It's a warning. Those who dare to step inside are greeted not by silence, but by the relentless, haunting voices of the damned. And the whispers don't just stay inside. Many who have visited St. Mary's claim they were never the same after leaving. They speak of waking up at night to hear faint voices in their own homes, of shadows moving in the corners of their vision, and of a cold, oppressive feeling that never quite goes away. It's as if the asylum leaves a mark, an invisible scar on anyone who crosses its threshold. Some even say the whispers follow them, growing louder over time until they can no longer distinguish them from their own thoughts. For those who hear the whispers, one thing is certain: St. Mary's doesn't just trap the lost souls of its past. It reaches out for more. Logan Carter had spent most of his 20s chasing the thrill of the unknown. Urban exploration was his drug of choice, and abandoned places were his playground. There was something intoxicating about stepping into forgotten ruins where life had once thrived, but now lay rotting, time frozen in peeling wallpaper and shattered windows. Logan didn't believe in ghosts or curses. To him, the stories surrounding places like St. Mary's Asylum were nothing more than sensationalized myths designed to keep curious minds like his at bay. But the more warnings he heard about the asylum, the more intrigued he became. The townspeople's fear only added fuel to his determination. If no one else dared to go, then he would. He arrived at St. Mary's just after sunset, the forest around the asylum already shrouded in an oppressive darkness. The path leading to the front gates was overgrown, the trees twisting into jagged shapes that clawed at the night sky. His flashlight cut through the shadows, illuminating the rusted gates that loomed ahead, their bars twisted as if by some immense force. The faint outline of the asylum rose beyond them, a hulking silhouette against the pale moonlight. The building looked alive, its shattered windows resembling hollow eyes that stared back at him with unblinking malice. Logan pushed the gate open, the metal screeching in protest. The sound echoed unnaturally, reverberating through the empty grounds and sending a chill down his spine. He shook it off. He wasn't here to scare himself with his own imagination. He was here to explore, document, and prove to his growing online audience that St. Mary's was nothing more than an old building with a dark history. His camera was strapped to his chest, already recording as he made his way toward the entrance. The front doors were still intact, their once grand wooden panels now warped and splintered. As he pushed them open, a rush of stale, damp air hit him like a physical force. The smell was overwhelming: mold, rot, and something faintly metallic like rusted iron or old blood. He stepped inside, his boots crunching on broken glass and debris. The lobby stretched out before him, a cavernous space illuminated only by the narrow beam of his flashlight. The walls were covered in graffiti, layers of spray paint scrawled over faded signs and crumbling plaster. But beneath the graffiti, he could still make out the original lettering: St. Mary's Asylum for the Mentally Ill. Logan moved further inside, his footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the building itself was pressing down on him. The floor was littered with debris: rusted wheelchairs, overturned gurneys, and scattered papers yellowed with age. He picked one up, holding it under his flashlight. It was a patient intake form, the ink faded but still legible. The name, Eleanor Voss, was scrawled across the top, along with the words extreme psychosis and violent tendencies. Logan shivered, dropping the paper back onto the ground. The deeper he ventured into the asylum, the more unsettling it became. The hallways stretched endlessly in both directions, their darkness swallowing the light from his flashlight. Every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of his boots, the rustle of his jacket, the occasional drip of water from somewhere above. But there was something else too, something faint. He paused, straining to listen. At first it was so quiet he thought he was imagining it. But as he stood there, the sound grew clearer, a soft, rhythmic tapping like fingernails on glass. Logan turned sharply, shining his flashlight toward the source of the noise. The beam illuminated a cracked window at the end of the hallway. The glass was smeared with grime, but beyond it, he could make out the shadowy outlines of the forest. The tapping stopped the moment his light touched the window. Logan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and forced a laugh. "Wind," he muttered to himself, though his voice sounded hollow in the empty corridor. Just the wind. But the unease lingered. As he continued to explore, the building seemed to change around him. The hallways grew narrower, the ceilings lower, and the air colder. The walls appeared to close in, their cracked surfaces glistening as if slick with sweat. His flashlight began to flicker, casting erratic shadows that danced and twisted in the corners of his vision. He smacked the flashlight against his palm, muttering a curse. The light steadied for a moment before dimming again, plunging him into near darkness. That's when he heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of his own breathing. But as he stood frozen in the dark, the whisper grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just one voice, it was a chorus. Dozens of overlapping murmurs that seemed to come from all around him. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was pleading, desperate. He spun around, his flashlight flaring back to life as he pointed it wildly in every direction. The corridor was empty. "Hello?" Logan called, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound composed. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt unnatural. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, the sound impossibly loud. Then a single voice broke the silence. "Get out." It was clear, sharp, and chillingly close, as if someone had spoken directly into his ear. Logan whipped around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. There was no one there. His pulse was racing now, adrenaline surging through his veins. He wanted to believe it was just his imagination, the power of suggestion playing tricks on his mind. But deep down, he knew better. Something was wrong with this place. It wasn't just abandoned. It was alive. The walls seemed to breathe, the air shifting subtly around him like the exhale of some unseen force. Logan took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But his pride and the promise of views and validation kept him rooted in place. He wasn't about to run from shadows and whispers. Still, as he pressed deeper into the asylum, a gnawing sense of dread began to take hold. The whispers hadn't stopped. They'd simply receded into the background, an almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the building. And though he couldn't see anyone, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The air inside St. Mary's grew colder with every passing second, sinking into Logan's skin and settling in his chest like a block of ice. The feeling was no longer just unease, it was outright dread, a primal warning that screamed at him to turn around and leave. But his pride had become his prison. The camera strapped to his chest was still rolling, capturing everything. The flickering beam of his flashlight, the scattered debris of a place long forgotten, and the oppressive shadows that seemed to swallow the light whole. Logan told himself he was fine, that he'd been in places like this before. But St. Mary's wasn't like the crumbling houses or derelict factories he'd explored. This place had teeth. As he made his way deeper into the asylum, the whispers returned, faint and teasing like they were deliberately staying just out of reach. They no longer seemed random. but deliberate, their cadence and tone shifting as if responding to his every movement. At first, Logan tried to rationalize it, convincing himself that the sounds were just the wind passing through broken windows or rats scuttling in the walls. But the whispers weren't coming from the walls. They were in the air, circling him like a predator toying with its prey. His flashlight began to falter again, the beam sputtering and dimming. He tapped it against his hand, his motions growing more frantic as the darkness around him deepened. The flickering light cast jagged, unpredictable shadows on the walls, and for a moment he thought he saw something move. It was quick, a flash of something just outside the beam of light, a shape too tall and too thin to be human. Logan froze, his breath hitching in his throat. He swung the flashlight toward the spot where he thought he'd seen it, but there was nothing there. "You're losing it," he muttered to himself, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound calm. "It's just your imagination, just shadows." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. The asylum felt alive now, its walls almost vibrating with a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from deep within the building. Logan felt as though he was being funneled toward something, each step taking him further from the safety of the outside world and closer to what? He didn't know, but the weight of it pressed on him like an invisible hand on his chest. He reached a fork in the hallway, the path splitting into two equally uninviting directions. The left corridor sloped downward, its cracked tiles slick with moisture. The right corridor was narrower, the walls covered in what looked like black mold that seemed to pulse in the dim light. Both paths seemed wrong, but standing still wasn't an option. The whispers were louder now, rising and falling in a rhythmic chant that made his skin crawl. Logan chose the left corridor, descending into what felt like the bowels of the asylum. The air grew colder still, each breath escaping his lips in a visible puff of vapor. The floor was uneven, the tiles warped and cracked as if the building itself had been twisted by some unseen force. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing back to him in distorted fragments that didn't quite match the rhythm of his movements. The corridor opened into a large room that had once been a communal space. Broken chairs and tables were scattered across the floor, their metal frames rusted and warped. The walls were lined with cabinets, their doors hanging open to reveal rows of decayed medical supplies. Syringes, glass bottles filled with unidentifiable liquids, and rusted scalpels that gleamed faintly in the weak light. In the center of the room stood a single gurney, its once white mattress stained a sickly yellow. Restraints dangled from its sides, their leather straps cracked and frayed. As Logan approached the gurney, a low groan reverberated through the room. He whipped around, shining his flashlight in every direction, but the room was empty. The sound came again, louder this time, and he realized it wasn't just a groan, it was a word. "Stay." The voice was deep and guttural, like it was being forced through a throat not meant for speaking. Logan's pulse skyrocketed, his hands trembling as he gripped the flashlight tighter. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cracking. The only response was a faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across metal. He turned back toward the gurney, and his blood turned to ice. The restraints were moving. At first it was subtle, a gentle sway as if caught in a non-existent breeze. But then they jerked violently, the leather straps snapping taut, as if something unseen was pulling against them. Logan stumbled back, his flashlight dropping to the floor and spinning wildly, casting erratic beams of light across the room. The shadows seemed to come alive, stretching and twisting into grotesque shapes that clawed at the walls. Scrambling to pick up his flashlight, Logan's hand brushed against something cold and wet. He yanked it back, shining the light on his fingers. They were smeared with a dark, viscous liquid that glistened black in the dim light. The smell hit him immediately, a pungent, metallic stench that turned his stomach. He wiped his hand on his jeans, his movements frantic and jerky. The groaning sound grew louder, reverberating through the walls and floor. It was joined by another sound, a high-pitched wail that sent shivers down his spine. The whispers were no longer whispers, they had become a cacophony, a chaotic chorus of voices that filled the room with their anguished cries. Logan clapped his hands over his ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. It was inside his head, vibrating through his skull and burrowing into his thoughts. "Stay," the voice repeated, louder and more insistent. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in as the shadows grew darker and more oppressive. Logan felt as though he was being swallowed whole, the weight of the asylum pressing down on him from all sides. He turned and ran, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he bolted back down the corridor. The whispers followed him, growing louder with every step, their voices overlapping in a maddening symphony of despair. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the exit just out of reach no matter how fast he ran. The air grew thicker, each breath a struggle as if the asylum itself was trying to suffocate him. When he finally burst into the lobby, the whispers stopped. The sudden silence was almost more unsettling than the noise. Logan stood there gasping for breath, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. The air was still and heavy, the oppressive atmosphere lingering like a shadow. He didn't wait to catch his breath. He turned and ran for the doors, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of St. Mary's. But as his hand touched the door handle, a voice whispered in his ear, so close it felt like breath against his skin. "You'll be back." Logan burst out of the asylum's front doors, his lungs burning as he gulped in the cold night air. His legs carried him forward on pure instinct, his boots crunching against the overgrown gravel path, leading away from the building. Behind him, the asylum loomed like a monstrous shadow, its cracked windows gleaming faintly in the moonlight like unblinking eyes. He didn't dare look back. The whispers still echoed in his ears, even though the night was now disturbingly silent. His heart thundered in his chest, each beat a desperate reminder that he was alive, though he wasn't sure for how much longer. Reaching his car, he fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling so violently that they slipped from his grasp. They clattered to the ground, and for a moment the world felt as though it had frozen. The forest around him was unnervingly still, the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves eerily absent. He crouched to retrieve the keys, his breath coming in shallow gasps. As his fingers closed around the metal, he felt it again, that suffocating presence. The sensation of being watched pressed down on him, heavier and more suffocating than ever before. Slowly, against every screaming instinct in his body, Logan lifted his gaze toward the asylum. It stood there in the distance, its silhouette etched against the night sky like a blackened wound on the horizon. But something was different. The windows, once dark and lifeless, now glowed faintly with an unnatural light, an eerie, pulsating red that seemed to seep into the air around it. Logan's stomach churned, bile rising in his throat as his vision swam. He tore his eyes away, scrambling to unlock the car door. The engine roared to life, and Logan slammed the car into gear, the tires kicking up gravel as he sped down the overgrown road. The trees closed in around him, their twisted branches forming a skeletal canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Shadows danced in the periphery of his vision, flickering and darting just out of reach. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he focused on the road ahead. But no matter how far he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't truly left. The whispers began again, faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the engine. Logan's grip on the wheel tightened as his pulse quickened. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something. A figure, a shadow, anything. But the road behind him was empty. Yet the whispers grew louder, more insistent, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony that seemed to rise from the very depths of his mind. "Stay," they urged, their tone dripping with malice. Logan shook his head violently, his teeth clenched as he tried to drown them out. "You're not real," he muttered, his voice cracking. "You're not real." But the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, their words twisting into taunts and accusations. They spoke of his fears, his failures, dredging up memories he had buried long ago. They whispered his name, drawing it out in a slow, mocking cadence that made his skin crawl. Logan slammed his fist against the dashboard, his breathing ragged. "Shut up!" he screamed, his voice echoing inside the car. The whispers ceased instantly, the sudden silence ringing in his ears. Logan's chest heaved as he gripped the wheel, his hands slick with sweat. He kept his eyes on the road, his heart pounding as he tried to convince himself that it was over. But then the radio crackled to life, the static filling the car with a low, grating hum. Logan's eyes darted to the dashboard, his stomach sinking. The radio wasn't even on. The static grew louder, sharper, until it was almost unbearable. Then, beneath the noise, a voice emerged, faint and distorted but unmistakable. "You'll never leave," it whispered, each word dripping with malice. Logan's blood ran cold. He slammed his hand against the radio, trying to turn it off, but the static persisted. The voice grew louder, clearer, until it was as if someone was sitting in the passenger seat, speaking directly into his ear. "We see you," it hissed. "We're with you." The car swerved as Logan's grip on the wheel faltered, the tires screeching against the pavement. He pulled over to the side of the road, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more suffocating. He sat there for a moment, his chest heaving as he tried to collect himself. "I'm losing my mind," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just his imagination. Something had followed him out of St. Mary's, something that wasn't bound by the physical walls of the asylum. He could feel it now, a heavy, suffocating presence that clung to him like a second skin. He looked down at his hands, his fingers still trembling. That's when he noticed the marks. Dark, bruise-like impressions encircled his wrists, as if unseen hands had gripped him tightly. Panic surged through him as he rubbed at the marks, his skin raw under his frantic touch. But no matter how hard he scrubbed, they wouldn't fade. The car's interior grew colder, the windows fogging up with a thin layer of condensation. Logan's breath formed visible clouds as he exhaled, his teeth chattering. He reached for the ignition, desperate to get back on the road, but the moment his fingers touched the key, the whispers returned. This time, they weren't just in his head. They were everywhere. In the air around him, in the rustling of the trees, in the groaning of the car's frame. The words were indistinct, a jumbled cacophony of sound that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. He clapped his hands over his ears, his eyes squeezed shut as he tried to block them out. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The whispers faded into laughter, a deep, guttural sound that sent a chill down his spine. He opened his eyes, and his blood turned to ice. The windows of the car were covered in handprints, dozens of them smeared across the glass as if pressed by invisible hands. They appeared slowly, one by one, each print larger and more distorted than the last. Logan's breathing quickened, his chest tight with terror. He reached for the door handle, desperate to escape, but the door wouldn't budge. The handprints began to multiply, spreading across the windshield until they completely obscured his view. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, until it was no longer human. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The handprints vanished, the air inside the car returning to its oppressive silence. Logan sat there, frozen, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. But one thought lingered, louder than the rest. He hadn't escaped. St. Mary's wasn't done with him. Logan thought he could outrun it. He believed that if he drove far enough, fast enough, he might finally leave the suffocating weight of St. Mary's behind. But deep down, a sickening truth gnawed at his sanity. It wasn't just a place he had fled from. It was something alive, something vast and hungry, and it had already burrowed deep inside him. The car sped down the empty highway, the headlights carving narrow tunnels of light into the oppressive darkness. The road stretched endlessly ahead, framed by skeletal trees whose twisted branches clawed at the sky. But as the miles rolled by, something felt wrong. Logan couldn't shake the sensation that the scenery outside wasn't changing. The same dead tree with a fractured trunk passed by on his left. Then again, minutes later, as if he were driving in circles without ever turning. He glanced at the odometer, and his stomach lurched. The numbers hadn't changed. The engine roared as the car pushed forward, but he wasn't moving. Not really. The realization hit him like ice water down his spine. St. Mary's hadn't let him go. It was still with him, pulling the strings of reality itself, bending the world into its labyrinthine design. His hands clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles pale and bloodless. The whispers returned, soft and insidious, slithering through the air like smoke. They weren't coming from the radio anymore. They were in the car, filling the space around him. Logan's breathing quickened as the voices overlapped, some hissing in guttural tones, others mocking him with laughter that felt like jagged glass against his ears. "You can't leave," one voice rasped, its tone sharp and cutting. "Why do you run?" Another sneered, its words dripping with malice. Logan slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The car skidded to a stop, and for a moment, everything was silent. He sat there gripping the wheel, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breathing. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the world. Slowly, he turned off the engine. The headlights flickered once, twice, before plunging him into total darkness. The quiet didn't last. A sound broke through the stillness, a rhythmic tapping, faint but deliberate. It came from behind him inside the car. Logan froze, his body rigid as the sound grew louder, closer, like nails tapping against glass. He didn't want to turn around. He didn't want to see what was there. But his body moved on its own, his neck twisting slowly, agonizingly, as his eyes sought the source of the noise. The back seat was empty, or at least it should have been. Shadows writhed in the darkness, shifting and twisting like living things. His heart raced as his eyes adjusted, the shadows coalescing into a shape, a figure sitting impossibly still. It was hunched, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its face obscured by the gloom. But Logan could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, burning into him like a physical weight. "Drive," it whispered, its voice low and grating, like metal scraping against stone. Logan didn't think. His hand shot out, turning the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and the headlights cut through the darkness once more. But when he looked in the rearview mirror, the figure was gone. The back seat was empty again, as if it had never been occupied. Logan gripped the wheel tightly, his mind racing. Was he losing his grip on reality, or was something far worse happening? The road ahead stretched endlessly, the same lifeless landscape repeating itself over and over. Logan's panic deepened as the whispers returned, louder this time, their words incomprehensible but laced with a venomous malice. He pressed harder on the gas pedal, the car hurtling forward at a dangerous speed. But no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't escape. And then, the road ended. Without warning, the pavement disappeared, replaced by an expanse of blackness that stretched infinitely in every direction. Logan slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just inches from the void. He stared ahead, his chest tight with terror. The headlights illuminated nothing, just an endless abyss that seemed to swallow all light, all hope. A low hum filled the air, growing louder and deeper, resonating through his bones. The void wasn't empty. Shapes began to emerge from the darkness, indistinct at first, but slowly becoming clearer. They were figures, human-like, but wrong. Their bodies twisted and broken, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow light that pierced through the darkness. Logan scrambled to put the car in reverse, his hands fumbling with the gear shift, but the car wouldn't move. The figures advanced, their movements slow and deliberate, their glowing eyes fixed on him. Logan's breath came in short gasps as he yanked at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. He was trapped. The figures reached the car, their hands pressing against the windows, leaving smudged, greasy prints on the glass. Their faces were inches away, their features grotesque and malformed. Their mouths moved, forming words he couldn't hear but could feel, the meaning sinking into his mind like poison. "Welcome home," they said, their voices a chorus of agony and despair. The void began to consume the car, the darkness seeping in through the cracks, filling the space with an oppressive cold. Logan screamed, his voice raw and desperate, but the sound was swallowed by the void. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the figure from the back seat, its face now clear. It was his own. Logan was never found. His car was discovered abandoned on the side of the road, the keys still in the ignition, the driver's seat empty. Local legends say that St. Mary's doesn't just haunt you, it takes you. It makes you a part of itself, trapping you in its endless web of despair and madness. So the next time you see an abandoned building and you feel that inexplicable pull to explore its secrets, remember Logan's story. Some places are abandoned for a reason. But before you go, ask yourself, if you were taken, would anyone even notice you were gone? If this story sent shivers down your spine, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any more terrifying stories. And now I leave you with another question. If the hospital is empty, who or what continues to lock the doors?